Hey everyone! Tonight we're not diving into battles, grand banquets, or royal scandals. Instead, we're stepping into the very personal and often very pungent world of medieval hygiene. This was a time when people sometimes feared water more than illness, when perfumed gloves and pomanders stood in for soap, and when tossing waste out of your window was perfectly acceptable. From communal bathhouses to linen dry bathing, and the occasional rosemary-infused soak, medieval cleanliness was nothing like what we imagine today. So, before you settle in and get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see this little historical campfire stretching out across the world. Baths, basins, and beliefs. When you imagine medieval Europe, your mind might leap to armored knights, bustling market towns, or shadowy castles. But tonight, we're not entering through the castle gates or the monastery doors. We're stepping into a washroom, or at least the medieval equivalent of one. It's a world that looks and smells very different from our own. A world where water was both essential and mistrusted, where bathing was sometimes considered healing, sometimes sinful, and sometimes simply dangerous. Let's begin in a small medieval village in the 13th century, somewhere in northern France. The air is damp. The cobblestone streets are narrow. Inside a timber-framed house with a thatched roof, a family prepares for their weekly washing ritual. In the corner sits a large wooden tub, patched and well-used. Water has been fetched from the nearest well, carried in wooden buckets along a muddy path. It took effort, multiple trips, sometimes hundreds of steps each way. Heating this water required burning wood, a valuable resource, so full baths were reserved for special occasions. Droplet water, a precious and problematic resource. In the medieval world, water wasn't as freely available as we might imagine. Wells, rivers, and public fountains supplied most households, but these sources were rarely clean by modern standards. Rivers doubled as washing places, water sources, and waste disposal channels. Wells could be contaminated by nearby cesspits or animal pens. For the average peasant family, water was something you carried, heated, rationed, and reused. Bathing in flowing water, like a river, carried its own risks. Rivers were cold most of the year, often polluted, and full of unpredictable currents. In towns, they were often clogged with refuse and human waste. Washing yourself downstream from a butcher's shop or tanner's yard was, to put it mildly, not the refreshing experience we might think of today. Yet water was also seen as spiritually significant. Many monasteries built elaborate washing areas, or lavatoria, near their refectories so that monks could wash their hands before communal meals. Pilgrims and nobles often washed before entering churches, echoing biblical traditions. In some ways, medieval Europeans recognized the cleansing symbolism of water far earlier than they embraced its hygienic benefits. Bathtub bathing rituals in homes. In private homes, bathing was often done in wooden tubs, sometimes in a corner of a room, sometimes outside in warmer months. A full-body bath was not a daily or even weekly event for most people. Instead, people relied on partial washing, using basins to wash the face, hands, and feet. Medieval texts and moral guides frequently mention washing the face and hands in the morning and before meals, reflecting both practical cleanliness and social etiquette. When a full bath was taken, it was a logistical challenge. Water was heated in pots over the hearth, poured into the tub and often shared among family members. The eldest or most respected person bathed first, followed by others, with the youngest or least important last. By the end, the water was often murky. This custom gave rise to the famous expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," because by the time the baby was bathed, the water was so opaque that you might not see them in it. Unlike Roman baths, which were communal and often daily, medieval bathing tended to be private, occasional, and pragmatic. There were exceptions, of course. Nobles sometimes indulged in elaborate bathing rituals with scented herbs and petals, while peasants might make do with a quick scrub using a rough cloth and cold water. The frequency of bathing depended on social status, climate, and local customs. Baths weren't just water. They were often infused with herbs, flowers, or even wine. Medieval medical theory, based on Galenic humors, suggested that certain herbs could balance the body's internal fluids. For example, chamomile or rosemary might be added for relaxation, sage for cleansing, or thyme for its supposed medicinal properties. Nobles might use rose petals or lavender to mask unpleasant odors. Sometimes, the water itself was heated with wine or vinegar, believed to strengthen the body. Bathing was also seen as a medical treatment. Physicians prescribed baths to treat fevers, skin conditions, or melancholy. Elaborate bathhouses in cities offered cures for various ailments, combining warm water, herbs, and sometimes massage. In this way, bathing was tied to medieval medicine as much as hygiene. However, these medical baths were often restricted to those who could afford them. Peasants might know the virtues of herbs, but lacked the means to heat large amounts of water regularly. Instead, they might wash with a damp cloth infused with herbs, a kind of medieval sponge bath. Medieval Europeans saw cleanliness not just as a physical matter, but as a moral and spiritual one. Being clean before prayer was considered proper and respectful. Many religious texts emphasized washing the hands and face as part of daily discipline. But paradoxically, excessive bathing was sometimes viewed with suspicion. Some religious writers warned against vanity and indulgence. The church didn't outright ban bathing, but it linked cleanliness with modesty and humility, not pleasure or luxury. For example, moralists might caution that spending too much time in a bathhouse could lead to sinful thoughts or temptations. Bathhouses in cities often blurred the lines between hygiene, socializing, and in some cases, prostitution. This complicated relationship with bathing contributed to the gradual decline of frequent bathing in certain periods, particularly as fears of disease grew. Bathing habits also followed the rhythms of the seasons. In summer, it was easier to heat water, dry clothes, and bathe outdoors. In winter, especially in Northern Europe, cold weather made bathing less appealing. Many people relied on dry washing methods, like scraping skin with rough cloths, changing undergarments more often, or applying powders to absorb sweat. Because laundry was also tied to water use, many families scheduled communal washing days in warmer months, an exhausting but essential task. This seasonal rhythm created a kind of annual hygiene cycle, where people were cleaner in warm months and grittier in winter. The divide between nobles and peasants extended to hygiene as well. Nobles had access to private bathhouses, sometimes built inside castles or manors, complete with heating systems, herbal infusions, and servants to prepare the baths. Some wealthier nobles bathed weekly or even more often, viewing bathing as a mark of refinement. Peasants, on the other hand, bathed when necessary, before major religious festivals, weddings, or after particularly dirty work. Their tubs were smaller, their water colder, and their baths rarer. Still, they were not entirely filthy, as some modern myths suggest. Periodic washing, careful use of linen underclothes, and social norms about washing hands and faces kept basic hygiene within a shared communal standard. And so, as night falls in our medieval village, the wooden tub sits cooling in the corner, the water cloudy after its long use. A few herbs float on the surface. The family wraps themselves in coarse linen and moves toward the hearth, satisfied with their weekly cleansing. For them, bathing was not about luxury, but about ritual, necessity, and a small moment of refreshment in a demanding life. But here's the question. As water flowed through medieval homes, churches, and bathhouses, was it seen more as a tool for survival, a symbol of purity, or a source of danger? The answer, as we'll see in the next section, is complicated, and it shaped the very way people thought about cleanliness for centuries to come. In the previous section, we set the scene for medieval bathing and daily hygiene. Wooden tubs in smoky cottages, herbal infusions swirling in cloudy water, and a culture that saw cleanliness through a spiritual and practical lens. But bathing was not simply a household matter. It intersected with religion, medicine, class, and even politics. To truly understand how medieval people related to water and cleanliness, we need to explore how these daily rituals were shaped by larger beliefs and institutions. The medieval church was one of the most powerful institutions in Europe, and its influence extended into the most intimate corners of daily life, including washing. From the earliest days of Christian monasticism, washing was considered a discipline of order and humility, not indulgence. Monks were expected to wash their hands before meals, to bathe occasionally for health, and to keep their habits, robes, reasonably clean. Monasteries built lavatoria, or washing houses, often near the refectory dining hall. These were stone or wooden basins with flowing water, sometimes channeled from nearby streams. Monks would gather here to wash their hands before eating, standing silently in rows. The water might flow through carved stone spouts, sometimes shaped like animal heads, into long troughs. These spaces were often architecturally beautiful in their simplicity. Arched stone, dim light, and the sound of running water creating a sense of solemn ritual. Bathing, however, was not a daily obligation, even for monks. Most monastic rules allowed full-body bathing only a few times a year or when medically necessary. The Benedictine rule, for example, permitted bathing for the sick and infirm, but discouraged excessive washing for healthy monks. The reasoning was both practical. Water and heating were labor-intensive, and spiritual. Excessive concern with the body could be seen as vanity. Among the laity, the church influenced hygiene more indirectly. Religious festivals, fasts, and feasts often dictated when people cleaned themselves and their clothing. People washed before attending Mass or taking part in major holy days. Certain pilgrimages required ritual washing before departure. In this way, the rhythm of cleanliness was woven into the liturgical calendar, blending the sacred with the mundane. While religion shaped attitudes toward bathing, medical theory defined how people understood its effects on the body. Medieval European medicine was based largely on the teachings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians, especially Galen, whose theories of the four humors dominated thought for centuries. The four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were believed to govern health and temperament. Bathing was thought to affect these humors by opening the pores and altering the body's internal balance. Warm water, for example, was believed to open the pores, releasing impurities but also making the body more vulnerable to external influences. For this reason, many physicians warned against bathing during periods of disease, like plague outbreaks. Once the pores were open, people thought foul airs or miasmas could enter the body and cause illness. At the same time, bathing was also prescribed as a medical treatment for various conditions. Physicians might recommend warm herbal baths for skin ailments, melancholy, or stagnant humors. Some city bathhouses advertise their facilities as health-giving, offering mineral or thermal baths similar to ancient Roman spas. For wealthier households, baths were often accompanied by medical advice. A noble suffering from lethargy might be advised to bathe in warm rosemary water once a week. Someone recovering from fever might soak in water infused with sage and vinegar. These rituals were not just about washing away dirt. They were about restoring balance to the body's invisible fluids. According to the medical thinking of the day, as towns and cities grew during the High Middle Ages, roughly 11th to 13th centuries, public bathhouses re-emerged as social institutions. Although they never reached the scale of the Roman baths, many urban centers built modest bathhouses where people could pay for hot water, clean towels, and sometimes herbal infusions. Descriptions from medieval chroniclers tell us that people of many social classes visited these bathhouses, often in the evenings. Men and women sometimes bathed separately, but in some regions mixed bathing was common, especially in German-speaking lands and parts of France. Bathing became both a practical necessity and a social occasion. Friends gathered, business was discussed, and meals were sometimes served at the bath. Wealthier patrons might bring musicians or servants to attend them. But bathhouses also developed a controversial reputation. Over time, some became associated with illicit behavior, gambling, drinking, or even prostitution. By the late Middle Ages, moral reformers and church authorities began to criticize public baths as places of temptation. This growing suspicion, combined with fears of disease during outbreaks of plague, contributed to the decline of urban bathhouses by the 16th century. In their prime, however, bathhouses reveal a medieval world where bathing was not entirely neglected. Many people valued the comfort and health benefits of a warm soak, even if it required a fee and carried a hint of scandal. For most people, especially peasants, regular washing of the body was less common than changing and cleaning clothes, particularly linen undergarments. Linen had a unique property. It wicked sweat and oils away from the skin. A clean linen shift or undershirt could make someone feel refreshed even without a full bath. Washing linen required access to large quantities of water, so it was often done communally near rivers or public washing areas. Women gathered with wooden paddles, lye soap, and strong arms to beat and scrub garments against stones or wooden boards. They spread the clothes out to dry on grass or bushes, sometimes whitening them with ash or sunlight. The term dry bathing was sometimes used to describe changing into clean linen as a substitute for bathing. In this sense, medieval hygiene was less about scrubbing the body and more about managing layers between skin and outer garments. Wealthier people could afford to change linen frequently, while poorer families might wash clothes less often, but they still understood that linen helped absorb and contain dirt and sweat. As bathing practices fluctuated, Scent became a form of hygiene and social signaling. Herbs and flowers were used to mask body odors, especially among the wealthy. Lavenders, rose petals, and rosemary were popular additives for baths and perfumes. Pomanders, small perforated containers filled with aromatic substances, were carried or worn around the neck. Gloves were sometimes perfumed to release a pleasant smell with every movement of the hands. For the devout, washing before prayer or pilgrimage carried spiritual weight. Cleansing the hands and face before entering a church symbolized purifying the soul as well as the body. Medieval people often described cleanliness in moral terms. To be physically clean was to honor God, but to be excessively concerned with appearances could slip into vanity. Some medieval towns developed surprisingly sophisticated systems to manage water for hygiene. Monastic communities built aqueducts and channels to provide clean water to washing areas. In places like London, Paris, and Florence, public fountains and conduits supplied water to city dwellers. Wealthier citizens sometimes piped water directly into their homes using wooden or lead pipes. These systems were limited and often prone to contamination, but they reveal a society that valued access to water for washing, cooking, and cleaning, even if daily bathing was uncommon. Urban regulations sometimes required residents to keep streets clean or limit where waste could be dumped, recognizing that filth affected everyone's health. This civic approach to cleanliness was not universal, but where it existed, it helped maintain basic hygiene standards for growing populations AS in Section 1. It's important to remember that bathing and washing followed seasonal rhythms. Winter discouraged full bathing, especially in cold climates. Many people relied on communal washing days in warmer months to launder clothes, clean homes, and wash bodies. Travelers noted that people often cleaned up before major festivals or after the agricultural off-season. This pattern meant that the medieval relationship with water was cyclical and practical, rather than daily and habitual like ours. People adapted to their environment, conserving heat and water in winter, using rivers and sun in summer. By now, it should be clear that medieval people didn't ignore hygiene. They approached it differently, guided by medical theories, religious beliefs, practical realities, and seasonal change. Bathing was occasional, but washing hands and faces, changing linen, and using herbs and scents were regular parts of life. Bathhouses offered communal bathing, even if not everyone could afford them. But this raises a curious question. If medieval Europeans had access to water, herbs, and even public bathing facilities, why did later centuries, especially the 16th through 18th, develop reputations for being even less clean? What changed in the relationship between water, health, and culture that caused hygiene practices to retreat before modern sanitation emerged? In the previous sections, we explored the personal and communal habits of medieval washing. The wooden tubs tucked into smoky homes, the monastic lavatoria, and the bathhouses where hygiene and social life intertwined. We also touched on how medicine and religion shaped attitudes toward water. But the story of medieval hygiene isn't complete without looking at the social hierarchies, changing urban environments, and the gradual shift in attitudes toward bathing and cleanliness over time. In this section, we move beyond daily habits to understand the broader cultural landscape that made medieval hygiene both structured and surprisingly fluid. In medieval society, how you cleaned yourself, and how often, was deeply tied to who you were. Class divisions shaped access to water, linen, soap, and private bathing spaces. For nobles, cleanliness could become a subtle display of wealth and refinement, while for peasants, it was largely about practicality and survival. Wealthier households often had dedicated bathing rooms. In some castles, there were private baths made of stone or large wooden tubs set in rooms where servants could bring in heated water through a chain of buckets. Noble families sometimes bathed together, with perfumed herbs floating in the water, musicians playing, and scented towels ready at hand. They could afford linen undergarments that were washed frequently and changed often, a luxury that created a literal barrier between the skin and dirt. For peasants, bathing facilities were far simpler. A family might share a single tub, reused for multiple people. Hot water was a scarce commodity, requiring firewood, labor, and time. Bathing was saved for special occasions, before weddings, religious festivals, or after physically demanding work. Instead of scented oils, peasants might use simple lye soap, harsh on the skin, or a rough cloth and cold water. Their clothing was usually wool over a linen shift, which absorbed most of the dirt and sweat. Yet it would be a mistake to think peasants lived in filth by choice. Within their means, they practiced practical hygiene, emphasizing washing hands before meals, changing undergarments when possible, and cleaning faces in the morning. These habits were shaped by community expectations and religious teachings, not by modern germ theory. But they were genuine efforts to maintain health and respectability. By the High Middle Ages, Europe was undergoing an urban transformation. Towns grew rapidly, with marketplaces, guild halls, and crowded tenements. Hygiene in cities posed new challenges. Narrow streets, animals, and human waste all accumulated in close quarters. As a result, urban authorities began to introduce rudimentary sanitation measures to manage waste and keep public areas cleaner. City councils in places like London, Paris, and Lübeck issued ordinances forbidding people from dumping refuse directly into streets. Public fountains and conduits were built to bring fresh water into cities, and these became gathering places where people collected water for cooking, washing, and sometimes bathing. In some towns, officials employed rakers or gong farmers, whose job was to collect and dispose of waste from privies and cesspits. Though the systems were far from modern sanitation, they represented an organized civic approach to cleanliness. Bathhouses also thrived in cities during this period. Public baths offered affordable washing facilities to urban dwellers who lacked private tubs. They were often located near rivers or aqueducts, making it easier to refill water. Many bathhouses doubled as social spaces, where business was discussed and friendships were formed. In some regions, mixed-gender bathing was common and accepted. In others, it was segregated or subject to moral scrutiny. As cities expanded, maintaining hygiene became not only a personal choice, but also a collective concern. Clean streets, clean water sources, and public bathhouses were considered essential to urban life. Even if their upkeep was imperfect, while bathing habits varied, the use of soap and scent became important markers of both cleanliness and social identity. Soap production existed throughout the medieval period, though quality varied. Southern Europe, particularly regions influenced by Arabic soap-making traditions, produced finer soaps made with olive oil and lye, early ancestors of Castile soap. Northern Europe often relied on rougher soaps made from animal fats and ash, which were cheaper and harsher. Wealthier individuals used soap not only for washing their bodies, but also for laundering their linen garments. A fresh linen shirt or chemise was a sign of personal upkeep, even if the person didn't bathe frequently. Perfumed waters, rose water, lavender water, or vinegar infused with herbs, were dabbed on skin or clothing to mask odors. Pomanders filled with aromatic substances hung from belts or necklaces, especially in crowded cities where smells could be overwhelming. For nobles, these scents were also status symbols, signaling refinement and wealth. For the middle and lower classes, herbs and vinegar were affordable ways to stay fresh and align with social expectations of cleanliness, particularly on holy days or during public events. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval hygiene is how it evolved in response to disease outbreaks, especially the plague. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, killed tens of millions of people across Europe and transformed how communities thought about health and cleanliness. Before germ theory, people believed that diseases were spread through miasmas, or foul airs. Bathing, which opened the pores, was thought to make the body more susceptible to these harmful airs. As a result, during plague years, some people reduced bathing, fearing that clean, open skin would invite illness. They instead relied more heavily on changing linen, burning herbs to purify the air, or carrying strong-smelling substances to protect themselves. Ironically, these precautions may have had mixed results. Less bathing meant less removal of fleas, the real carriers of plague, but frequent linen changes could have helped reduce lice and some skin infections. Public bathhouses suffered during plague years, with many closing temporarily or permanently. Authorities worried that crowded, warm bathhouses could be sources of contagion. This shift marked the beginning of a cultural reorientation, from viewing baths as healthful to sometimes viewing them with suspicion, especially in disease-prone times. As these changes unfolded, the Church's moral stance on bathing also shifted. While early medieval religious texts encouraged modest washing and associated cleanliness with godliness, later writings sometimes linked frequent bathing to vanity or sin. Mixed-gender bathhouses, once tolerated in some regions, came under increasing scrutiny. Preachers warned against the temptations of bathhouses, painting them as places where moral discipline could erode. This didn't mean people stopped washing, but it added a layer of moral judgment to hygiene practices. A noble bathing in privacy was one thing. A commoner enjoying a mixed bathhouse was another. The social meaning of bathing grew more complex. It could signal piety, luxury, or moral laxity, depending on the context. Amid these cultural shifts, linen remained the backbone of personal hygiene. Clean linen undergarments acted as a barrier between skin and outer clothing, soaking up oils and sweat. Changing linen frequently could give the impression, and sometimes the reality, of cleanliness without frequent bathing. Travelers of the time often remarked on the European habit of changing linen as a substitute for bathing. A person in freshly laundered linen, perfumed lightly with herbs, could appear quite well-groomed even if they hadn't bathed in weeks. This practice persisted for centuries and was particularly important during colder months when heating water was difficult. Taken together, medieval hygiene was a complex balance of practical adaptation, social signaling, religious influence, and evolving medical beliefs. People weren't uniformly filthy, nor were they uniformly clean. Instead, they developed a contextual hygiene system, adapted to their environment, beliefs, and resources. Urban dwellers had access to fountains, bathhouses, and soap, but also had to contend with crowded conditions and waste. Rural peasants bathed less frequently, but practiced regular face washing and linen changing. Nobles used bathing as a form of luxury and display. Monks washed according to a strict rhythm tied to prayer and humility. And during times of plague, fear reshaped these practices in ways that might seem contradictory to us today. And so, as you picture a medieval town at dusk, lanterns flickering, bathhouse doors closing, laundry flapping faintly in the evening breeze, you might wonder, how did these layered, often inconsistent habits shape the centuries that followed? Medieval Europeans had, in many ways, built a functional hygiene system without understanding germs. But this system was fragile, shaped by belief more than science. In the next section, we'll see how shifting attitudes in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance set the stage for both decline and eventual transformation in hygiene practices, a story of continuity, retreat, and eventual rediscovery. Over the last 3 sections, we've explored how medieval Europeans bathed, or didn't, how religion and medicine shaped their understanding of cleanliness, how bathhouses rose and fell, and how linen and ritual washing carried the weight of hygiene in daily life. In this final section of Story 1, we zoom out to look at the long arc of medieval hygiene practices, how they began to shift toward the Renaissance, and what they reveal about the relationship between humans, water, and belief. It's a story that is neither purely one of progress nor decline, but rather of cyclical attitudes, shaped by fear, faith, practicality, and evolving worldviews. By the late Middle Ages, around the 14th and 15th centuries, a noticeable change in hygiene attitudes began to ripple through European societies. While early and high medieval periods embraced occasional but structured bathing, both in private tubs and public bathhouses, later centuries saw a growing caution toward water. This shift was driven in large part by disease outbreaks, especially the Black Death and its subsequent waves. As plague revisited towns repeatedly, the prevailing medical theories of the time, particularly the belief in miasmas, or disease-bearing airs, led physicians and civic leaders to warn against exposing the skin by bathing too often. Bathing opened the pores, they believed, leaving the body vulnerable to invisible threats. Urban bathhouses, once social hubs, were increasingly portrayed as unsanitary and morally dubious. Authorities closed some during plague years, and others simply fell out of fashion among the elite, who preferred the relative safety of perfumed linens and private washing rituals. What had once been seen as therapeutic and communal was now tinged with suspicion. Among the upper classes, hygiene did not disappear, it changed form. Rather than communal bathhouses, nobles leaned on private washing rituals, scented waters, and frequent changes of linen. This era saw the rise of perfumery as a marker of refinement and social distinction. Wealthy individuals carried pomanders filled with aromatic substances, wore perfumed gloves, and sprinkled rosewater on clothes and skin. Water still played a role, but it was localized and controlled. Face washing, hand washing before meals, and occasional full baths in private rooms. Bathing was no longer a communal evening event. It was a curated personal act, separated from the masses. This change also reflected shifting architectural trends. In noble households, rooms were increasingly specialized. Instead of one multifunctional hall, there were designated chambers, including rooms that might serve for private bathing. Tubs were still made of wood, but they were set in warm rooms, often lined with cloth to retain heat, and filled with water carried by servants. Herbal infusions added scent and a sense of medical benefit. This retreat inward among the nobility created a cultural divide. For peasants and townsfolk, public or semi-public washing remained essential. For nobles, cleanliness became more about presentation and control than about shared spaces or regular immersion in water. Throughout this shift, linen clothing remained the backbone of personal hygiene. Clean linen shifts, chemises, or undergarments absorbed sweat and body oils, while outer garments, often wool, were washed less frequently. Regularly changing linen, especially among those who could afford several sets, gave the impression of cleanliness even without frequent bathing. Travelers from other regions sometimes noted this peculiarity. Europeans, they observed, might not bathe often, but they wore very clean linen and scented it with herbs or perfumes. This practice persisted well into the Renaissance and beyond, forming a kind of dry hygiene system that substituted fabric for soap and water. Peasants, too, relied on linen, though fewer garments meant washing days were more labor-intensive. Communal laundry areas by rivers were crucial hubs of activity, places where hygiene met social life. Women beat linen against stones, used ash lye to clean stubborn stains, and spread clothing to dry in the sun. Laundry wasn't merely practical. It was also one of the few moments where communities organized cleanliness together, especially in villages without access to bathhouses. By the late medieval period, urban authorities began to regulate hygiene more actively, though still through pre-modern lenses. Ordinances required streets to be swept, cesspits to be emptied regularly, and waste to be thrown away from public fountains. Some towns prohibited dumping animal entrails into waterways. Public fountains and conduits were increasingly maintained, and some cities experimented with bringing cleaner water from outside sources through wooden or lead pipes. While this was still far from modern sanitation, it shows that medieval societies recognized the public nature of hygiene, that clean water and clean streets benefited everyone. Interestingly, some towns also regulated bathhouses, setting rules for their operation or closing them during epidemics. In some places, they were inspected for cleanliness, though by modern standards these inspections were rudimentary. Hygiene became both a private responsibility and a public matter, managed through civic ordinances, religious guidance, and communal custom. Throughout these centuries, religion remained intertwined with hygiene. Washing hands before meals, washing before entering churches, and cleaning oneself for religious festivals were all embedded in daily life. The act of washing carried spiritual symbolism, echoing biblical traditions of purification. Monasteries continued to maintain lavatoria and encourage regular washing for hands and faces. Pilgrims washed before journeys, and rituals like baptism reinforced the symbolic power of water as a cleanser, not just of the body, but of the soul. However, the Church's evolving view of public bathing, as something morally ambiguous, helped shape the decline of communal bathhouses. Preachers increasingly warned of temptation and sin in mixed-gender spaces. Cleanliness became a private virtue rather than a public one, and bathing was moralized rather than medicalized. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, Many of these medieval hygiene practices persisted. Linen changing remained central. Scent and perfumery flourished. Private bathing was still practiced among the wealthy. But the infrastructure of hygiene was changing. Urban populations were growing, disease outbreaks continued, and new ideas about the body were beginning to circulate through revived classical texts. Interestingly, public bathing did not vanish everywhere at once. In some German-speaking regions and parts of Central Europe, bathhouses persisted well into the 16th century. In Southern Europe, influenced by Roman traditions and Islamic bathing culture, more sophisticated baths lingered longer. The decline of bathing was uneven, a patchwork of cultural differences across the continent. This period set the stage for a temporary retreat from frequent bathing in some regions, followed by renewed interest centuries later during the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, when plumbing and germ theory transformed hygiene forever. It's tempting to imagine the medieval world as uniformly dirty, a place where people feared water and never washed. But this is a myth, one created in part by later writers in the 18th and 19th centuries who contrasted their own modern practices with an exaggerated image of medieval backwardness. In reality, medieval hygiene was a system that made sense within its cultural and technological framework. People understood cleanliness through religion, medical theory, and community norms. They washed hands and faces, changed linen regularly, and bathed occasionally, sometimes in elaborate bathhouses, sometimes in simple wooden tubs. Their approach was different from ours because their understanding of disease was different. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, they shaped their habits according to what seemed logical, balancing humors, avoiding bad air, and aligning washing with religious rhythms. As you imagine a medieval evening, the hearth glowing softly, a family gathered after washing their faces and hands in a shared basin, linen garments drying by the fire, the sounds of distant church bells. Remember that this was a world where cleanliness was not absent, but differently defined. The wooden tubs, herbal waters, linen garments, and cautious bathhouses tell a story not of neglect, but of adaptation. For peasants, washing meant survival and dignity. For nobles, it was luxury and refinement. For monks, it was discipline. For cities, it was an emerging public concern. Each of these threads wove together to form the tapestry of medieval hygiene, a tapestry more nuanced than the stereotypes would have us believe. The medieval relationship with water reveals something timeless. Cleanliness is always cultural. It reflects what a society values, fears, and believes. Just as we tie hygiene to health and identity today, medieval people tied it to faith, community, and social structure. And so we end this story not with a bath, but with a quiet basin of water gently reflecting firelight. A small, simple tool, like so many throughout history, that sustained life and shaped civilization. Garlic, herbs, and smoke. How medieval people masked. When you picture the Middle Ages, your mind may conjure up the smells of roasting meat in great halls, incense drifting through cathedral naves, or perhaps the earthy scent of freshly turned soil in peasant fields. But there's another, less romantic dimension to the medieval world, the everyday battle against odor. Before soap was common, before deodorant existed, and long before plumbing transformed personal hygiene, medieval people relied on a fascinating mix of garlic, herbs, flowers, scented waters, and even smoke to keep themselves and their surroundings smelling acceptable, or at least tolerable. This section begins our exploration of the medieval sensory world, where scent wasn't just about personal preference. It was deeply tied to health, spirituality, social status, and survival. Medieval Europeans lived in close quarters, whether inside bustling city walls or in crowded rural cottages. Hearth smoke filled rooms. Animals often lived under the same roof, and streets were not known for cleanliness. In such a world, managing odors was both a practical necessity and a cultural expression. Scent wasn't merely decorative. People believed that smell itself carried health or harm. According to medieval medical theory, foul odors could spread disease. This idea, known as miasma theory, suggested that bad air carried sickness into the body. If a place smelled foul, it was assumed to be dangerous to your health. Pleasant scents, on the other hand, were thought to strengthen the body and ward off illness. Sweet-smelling herbs and flowers could fortify the heart, cleanse the air, or strengthen the humors. In this way, scent functioned almost like medicine. A perfumed glove wasn't just fashionable, it was protective. Among the many strong smells that dominated medieval life, garlic held a special place. It was valued for its culinary, medicinal, and even spiritual properties. Garlic was believed to purify the blood, strengthen the body, and repel harmful forces, whether they were physical diseases or evil spirits. Peasants often consumed garlic as part of their daily diet, both for flavor and health. It was cheap, hearty, and easy to store through long winters. Nobles, too, used garlic, though sometimes in more measured quantities or mixed with other herbs to soften its pungency. Interestingly, garlic was sometimes rubbed on the body or worn to protect against disease. In plague years, people might wear garlands of garlic, believing that its strong smell would push away infected air. Some even hung it near windows or doorways, treating it as a protective barrier. For all its practical uses, garlic's odor was intense. A person who had eaten or rubbed themselves with garlic was unmistakable. This was not necessarily seen as shameful. It was associated with vigor, work, and health. But among the wealthy, garlic was sometimes considered too rustic or coarse for formal occasions, which gave rise to more refined ways of scenting the body. For those who could afford them or grow them, herbs and flowers were the backbone of medieval scent culture. Rosemary, lavender, sage, thyme, chamomile, marjoram, rose petals, violets, and mint all appeared frequently in household manuals and herbals as ingredients for scenting clothing, water, or the air. Households dried herbs and hung them in bundles from beams and rafters, both for practical storage and to perfume the space. As the air moved through the house, the scent would slowly release. Some families scattered crushed herbs or petals on rushes. The straw or reeds spread on floors, so that when walked upon, the herbs released fresh fragrances to mask everyday smells. For personal use, herbs might be stuffed into linen sachets and tucked into garments. Women sometimes wore small pouches of dried lavender or rose petals in their bodices. Men and women alike carried pomanders, small perforated balls made of metal or carved wood, filled with aromatic herbs, spices, or resins. These could be worn on belts, around the neck, or carried in the hand to sweeten the air around oneself. Another popular method of masking odor involved scented waters. Wealthier households prepared or purchased rosewater, lavender water, or vinegar infused with herbs. These were dabbed on hands, faces, and clothing. Scented waters weren't perfumes in the modern sense. They were lighter, often homemade and used generously. Rosewater was especially valued. It symbolized purity, refinement, and spiritual grace. Monasteries sometimes distilled rosewater for religious and medicinal purposes, and nobles sprinkled it on linen, gloves, and rooms. Vinegar infused with herbs was used not only for scent, but also as a kind of protective tonic, believed to cleanse the air of harmful miasmas. During plague years, for thieves' vinegar, a mixture of vinegar and strong-smelling herbs like rosemary, sage, wormwood, and cloves, was famously used by people who believed it would protect them from disease. Whether or not it worked medically, the pungent odor was certainly memorable in a world without aerosol sprays or scented candles. Smoke itself played a crucial role in masking odors. People burned herbs, resins, and woods to perfume indoor spaces. Juniper, rosemary, and frankincense were commonly burned, both for their pleasant scent and their supposed power to purify the air. Religious spaces used incense in rituals, and this practice carried over into domestic life. Burning incense or herbs in a home wasn't just for luxury. It was believed to drive away illness and evil. In wealthier homes, rooms might be fumigated with burning rosemary or other aromatics before guests arrived. Even the daily smoke from hearth fires helped mask other household smells, though it brought its own distinctive scent. For many medieval Europeans, the smell of wood smoke was simply the smell of home. It's important to remember that while herbs and smoke were common to all classes, the way scent was used signaled social status. Peasants relied on herbs they could grow themselves: lavender, sage, thyme, and garlic, which was plentiful. Their homes were perfumed simply, through hanging bundles or floor rushes. Scented vinegar might be made in small batches. The nobility, on the other hand, had access to exotic spices and imported ingredients. They might scent their gloves with cloves, use rosewater distilled from distant gardens, or burn expensive resins from the East. Perfumed gloves became fashionable in royal courts, and pomanders were crafted from silver and gold, often engraved with intricate designs. Smelling pleasant became a sign of refinement, just as smelling strongly of garlic or sweat was associated with manual labor. This division didn't mean peasants were unclean. It simply reflected different cultural markers of identity. Beyond health and status, scent had a spiritual dimension in medieval life. Incense and herbs were essential in church rituals. Frankincense and myrrh symbolized prayer rising to heaven. Clean, sweet smells were associated with holiness, while foul smells were linked to sin or disease. Hagiographies, stories of saints, often described the bodies of holy figures emitting a sweet odor after death as a sign of their sanctity. In daily life, washing hands before meals, scenting clothing, and burning herbs weren't just practical. They echoed spiritual ideals of order, purity, and moral health. For many medieval people, cleanliness and good smells were part of living rightly in both body and soul, that we often imagine the Middle Ages as visually drab or muddy, but medieval people experienced their world through scent as vividly as through sight. Odors carried information. A market smelled of spices, fish, livestock, and sweat. A noble's hall smelled of herbs, smoke, and perfume. A church smelled of incense and wax. Scent told you where you were, who was near, and sometimes whether danger was present. Managing scent wasn't a luxury. It was part of navigating daily life, a kind of quiet, constant work embedded into routines and beliefs. And so, As night falls over a medieval town, the air is alive with smells. Rosemary smoke curling out of a chimney, garlic stewing in a pot, rose water sprinkled on linens, and the earthy rush of animals settling in for the night. It's a landscape of scent, complex, practical, and deeply meaningful. But this raises a curious question. Was medieval scent culture primarily about masking what couldn't be cleaned, or was it its own form of hygiene, a different but equally deliberate way of caring for the body and environment? The answer lies in how herbs, smoke, and scent became intertwined with medieval medicine and belief. The role of garlic as a household staple and odor shield, the way herbs and flowers perfumed both homes and clothing, and how burning smoke was believed to cleanse the air. Now, in this section, we'll go deeper, examining how medical theory, trade, religious ritual, and evolving urban life intertwined with scent, turning it into a powerful, if often misunderstood, tool for hygiene and health. To understand medieval deodorizing practices, we need to fully grasp how people understood smell and disease. Modern science links disease to microbes, tiny organisms invisible to the naked eye. Medieval Europeans, lacking germ theory, relied on ancient ideas from Galen and Hippocrates. One of the most influential was miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through foul or corrupted air. Miasmas were thought to arise from rotting matter, stagnant water, waste, decaying plants, or unburied bodies. Bad smells weren't just unpleasant, they were dangerous. Breathing them in could unbalance the humors or directly sicken the body. For this reason, good smells were more than a luxury. They were a defense mechanism. A pomander of rosemary and cloves wasn't carried just for elegance. It was believed to actively repel disease by overpowering or purifying the surrounding air. Burning juniper or sage in the home wasn't merely decorative. It was an act of protection. Physicians advised people to strengthen their brains and hearts with pleasant scents, especially during outbreaks of plague or fever. Wealthier individuals burned costly resins to purify their homes, while poorer families relied on bundles of herbs and smoke. Everyone, however, shared the same underlying idea. Smell could affect health. Medieval households, especially among peasants and townsfolk, functioned as miniature apothecaries. Herbs were grown in gardens, collected from fields, or purchased in markets. Women often acted as primary keepers of this knowledge, passing recipes for scented waters, herbal sachets, and fumigations from generation to generation. A typical household might keep rosemary, lavender, thyme, sage, mint, chamomile, marjoram, and rose petals either dried or fresh. They were used to flavor food, but also to scent rooms, laundry, and clothing. Herbs were mixed with vinegar to create aromatic waters, which could be sprinkled on linens, floors, or the body. One common practice was strewing herbs on floors, especially on top of rushes or straw. As people walked across the floor, the herbs released their fragrance, slowly deodorizing rooms over time. This was practical in homes with animals, mud floors, and smoky hearths. A layer of crushed lavender, chamomile, or mint underfoot made life a little more pleasant, and, according to miasma theory, a little safer. Another method involved boiling herbs in water to create scented steam. Some households fumigated rooms by boiling rosemary or juniper and letting the vapors fill the air. Physicians sometimes prescribed fumigation for corrupted chambers, recommending that patients breathe in aromatic smoke to strengthen their lungs. These domestic remedies reveal a society in which smell, health, and cleanliness overlapped, creating a sensory approach to hygiene that was surprisingly systematic. If different from modern expectations, be why the High Middle Ages, 11th to 13th centuries, trade routes across the Mediterranean and Silk Road brought exotic spices and resins to Europe. Frankincense and myrrh arrived from Arabia. Cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg came from Southeast Asia. Musk and ambergris from distant lands. For the wealthy, these substances were prized for their rarity, expense, and powerful scent. They were used in pomanders, perfumes, and fumigations. Perfumed gloves made with clove and cinnamon oils became fashionable in royal courts. Royal inventories list pouches filled with ambergris, a waxy, sweet-smelling substance from Wales, and musk, both considered highly prestigious scents. But these weren't merely fashion accessories. According to contemporary medical thought, spices had warming and cleansing properties, which made them ideal for fortifying the body against illness. A noble wearing clove-scented gloves wasn't just being stylish. They were performing a kind of portable air purification, warding off invisible dangers. The use of imported scents also reinforced social hierarchies. Peasants might rely on garden herbs, but nobles could afford cloves, frankincense, or ambergris, a sensory display of wealth as much as a practical deodorant. The medieval church was one of the most consistent users of scent, both to mark sacred space and to reinforce spiritual symbolism. Incense, particularly frankincense and myrrh, played a central role in liturgy. During Mass, incense smoke was believed to carry prayers heavenward, creating a literal and figurative purification of the air. Churches were often dim, stone structures filled with candles and the smell of burning wax. Incense added another layer, creating a distinctive olfactory environment. For medieval worshippers, the smell of incense was the smell of the sacred, instantly recognizable and comforting. This religious use of scent influenced domestic life as well. Many families burned herbs at home, especially on holy days, mirroring church rituals. Scenting oneself or one's home with sweet smells could echo spiritual purity. Conversely, foul smells were often associated with sin, death, or the demonic. In hagiographies, saints' biographies, holy figures' bodies were said to emit a sweet odor after death, while sinners were associated with rot and stench. Thus, scent was not only physical, but also moral and spiritual, woven into the very fabric of how medieval people understood good and evil, health and disease. As towns grew, urban smells intensified. Markets bustled with fish, meat, spices, and people. Tanneries produced harsh chemical odors. Animal dung littered streets, and waste often flowed through open ditches. To navigate this sensory overload, urban dwellers developed techniques for personal scent bubbles. Pomanders, perfumed gloves, and scented cloths allowed people to create small zones of pleasant air around themselves as they moved through the city. Physicians even advised holding a sweet-scented sponge or handkerchief to the nose in crowded places to filter out bad air. Wealthier urban homes often burned aromatic woods and herbs to counteract city smells drifting in through windows. In some places, public spaces were perfumed during major festivals, with streets strewn with herbs or fountains spouting rosewater. Royal entries, processions, and holy days were occasions to temporarily transform the smellscape of a town, signaling power, holiness, and celebration through scent. Another significant element of medieval odor control was laundry, especially linen garments. Linen absorbed body oils and sweat, and frequent changing of linen served as a substitute for regular bathing. To enhance this, people often perfumed their laundry, soaking or sprinkling it with rosewater or vinegar infused with herbs. Wealthier households sometimes stored clothing with herbs or spices in wooden chests, so that garments would carry pleasant scents when worn. Gloves and undergarments were particularly targeted for scenting, as they were closest to the skin. This practice blurred the line between hygiene and fashion. Clean, scented linen didn't just smell nice. It signaled cleanliness, health, and, for the upper classes, refinement. A noble who smelled of rosewater and cloves communicated wealth and sophistication in a way words couldn't. Beyond its cultural and aesthetic roles, scent functioned as a defensive barrier in times of crisis. During plague years, fumigation was widespread. Households burned strong-smelling herbs, fumigated rooms with smoke, or carried sponges soaked in vinegar. Physicians wore beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, not because they understood contagion, but because they believed purified air would protect them. Even peasants adopted these practices in simpler forms. Hanging garlic and sage, burning juniper in hearths, or carrying pouches of mint became common defensive rituals. In this sense, odor masking was part of the medieval public health toolkit, based on their understanding of how disease spread. Why now? It's clear that medieval Europeans didn't simply tolerate bad smells. They actively managed their sensory environment using garlic, herbs, smoke, imported spices, and religious rituals. Scents served as medicine, protection, social signal, spiritual expression, and everyday comfort. But here's an intriguing question to carry forward. As trade expanded and medical ideas slowly evolved, did scent remain primarily a health tool, or did it begin to shift toward fashion and luxury, especially among the upper classes? In the next section, we'll examine how these fragrant practices were woven into daily routines, seasonal rhythms, and shifting social norms, revealing scent's enduring power in medieval life. In the first two sections, we uncovered how medieval Europeans managed odor through herbal knowledge, domestic rituals, imported spices, and spiritual symbolism. Scent, as we've seen, wasn't a mere afterthought. It was central to how people understood health, identity, and their environment. Now, in this third section, we'll explore how these fragrant practices were woven into daily routines, seasonal rhythms, social structures, and public life, revealing how scent functioned as both a shared cultural language and a personal form of self-presentation. For most medieval Europeans, odor management was not a special event, but a quiet, continuous part of daily life. Just as one might today brush their teeth or apply deodorant without much thought, medieval people incorporated scenting rituals seamlessly into their routines. A peasant household might begin the morning by stirring embers in the hearth and adding aromatic herbs like rosemary or sage to the fire. As the smoke rose, it perfumed the single-room home, masking the smells of animals, earth floors, and stored food. Someone might sprinkle vinegar infused with mint or lavender onto a cloth to wipe down tables or wash faces and hands. In towns, markets opened early, filling the streets with a powerful mix of aromas: freshly baked bread, butchered meat, fish, herbs, tanned leather, and smoke. Wealthier townsfolk might prepare themselves for the day by scenting gloves or pomanders, holding them to their noses as they moved through crowded streets. Before heading to church, washing hands and faces was often accompanied by dabbing on scented water, particularly rose water, which carried both spiritual and social connotations of purity and refinement. Evening routines also involved scent. As hearth fires burned down, some households added bundles of herbs to the embers to cleanse the air overnight. Laundry that had been washed during the day might be hung near the fire, absorbing the aroma of both smoke and herbs. These repetitive acts created a steady olfactory rhythm, shaping the sensory atmosphere of medieval homes day after day. Just as bathing followed the seasons, scenting practices changed with the calendar. In spring and summer, fresh herbs were abundant. People harvested lavender, sage, rosemary, and chamomile, drying them in bundles to hang in rafters for later use. Flowers like roses and violets were gathered and distilled into scented waters, or preserved in vinegar for future household cleaning and perfuming. Summer laundry days often included soaking linens in scented water before drying them in the sun. The combination of sunshine, herbs, and fresh air produced a scent that many medieval texts describe almost reverentially, a sign of both physical and moral cleanliness. Autumn brought different scents. Juniper branches, pine, and dried herbs burned to warm the home and purify the air as temperatures dropped. In winter, when fresh herbs were scarce and water was harder to use, smoke became the dominant deodorizer. Households relied on dried herb bundles, stored rosewater, or vinegar infusions. Linen changing took on even greater importance during cold months, when full bathing was rare. Festivals and holy days added another layer to this cycle. During Christmas or Easter, towns sometimes perfumed streets with herbs and flowers. Churches burned more incense. Wealthy households might bring out their finest imported scents, filling halls with aromas meant to impress visitors and symbolize spiritual joy. Laundry wasn't just a chore. It was one of the key ways scent entered everyday medieval life, particularly among peasants and urban commoners. Without modern plumbing, laundry required significant coordination. Women gathered at rivers, wells, or communal washing areas, carrying linen garments and wooden paddles. They soaked clothes in lye or vinegar mixtures, scrubbed them against stones or boards, then rinsed and wrung them out. Herbs were often added to wash water. Lavender, chamomile, sage, and mint were common choices. As the laundry dried in the open air, these scents infused the linen. Clean linen, especially undergarments, became a marker of freshness and self-respect, even when full-body bathing was infrequent. For townsfolk, laundry could also be a communal spectacle. Large wash days might line entire riverbanks with garments drying on hedges and grass. The air would be filled with the combined fragrance of water, herbs, and fresh cloth, temporarily transforming the smellscape of a neighborhood. Among wealthier households, laundry rituals took place indoors or in courtyards, and garments might be stored afterward in chests lined with aromatic herbs or spices, another layer of perfuming that maintained the scent until the next wearing. In this way, linen acted like a portable scent diffuser, surrounding its wearer with a clean herbal aroma. scent carried clear social meanings in medieval society. Just as clothing or speech could indicate one's place in the hierarchy, so could the way a person smelled. Peasants, living and working close to animals and the land, often carried the strong odors of garlic, smoke, and herbs, not as neglect, but as part of their reality. Garlic, especially, was associated with vigor, work, and protection. Townsfolk might smell of the market, fish, spices, smoke, and the herbs they used to cleanse their homes. The nobility, by contrast, deliberately cultivated sense of refinement and distance from labor. Rosewater, cloves, ambergris, and musk became markers of class. A perfumed glove or gilded pomander signaled that one lived in a world apart from muddy streets and smoky hearths. Scent helped draw invisible lines between classes, creating olfactory signatures that reinforced social structures. This doesn't mean peasants smell bad by their society's standards. Rather, their scents communicated different values: closeness to the land, practicality, and protective traditions. Nobles signaled wealth and refinement through rarity and delicacy of aroma. Daily life in the medieval period was inseparable from religious practice, and scent was one of the bridges between the mundane and the sacred. Before meals, washing hands and sometimes scenting them with rosewater was not only a gesture of cleanliness, but also one of respect for food, for guests, and, implicitly, for God. On holy days, churches filled the air with incense. Parishioners associated sweet smells with holiness and foul smells with sin, disease, or death. Religious texts often described heaven as a place of sweet fragrance, while hell was imagined as reeking of sulfur and rot. This moral lens meant that managing one's scent was partly a spiritual act, reflecting one's alignment with cleanliness, order, and piety. Pilgrimages and religious processions often carried herbs and incense, filling roads and churches with strong aromas. Scent acted as a portable sign of sanctity, just as pomanders functioned as portable air purifiers. Medieval towns were olfactory mosaics. The butcher's quarter smelled sharply different from the tanner's yard. The marketplace differed from the cathedral square. Managing public smells required shared cultural codes, not modern sanitation systems. City authorities occasionally ordered strewing of herbs in streets before major processions or royal visits. Festivals might see fountains spouting rosewater. Bathhouses sometimes burned incense to improve their atmosphere and mask steam and sweat. Though these efforts were temporary, they reflect a conscious shaping of public smellscapes, not just private ones. People navigated these smellscapes with practiced familiarity. A whiff of certain herbs might indicate a nearby laundry day. The scent of garlic and juniper might signal a home fumigating against illness. Rosewater might hint at nobility passing by. Scent has always had a powerful link to memory, and medieval people were no different. Certain smells were tied to specific times of year, events, or places. For many, the scent of rosemary smoke in winter hearths or lavender-infused linen drying under the sun would have been as emotionally evocative as familiar smells are to us today. Moreover, because scent was actively created and maintained, it became part of individual and community identity. A noble household might be remembered for the fragrance of imported spices and rosewater. A monastery might be associated with incense and clean stone. A village might carry the mingled scents of herbs, livestock, and river water. These smells were not accidental. They were cultivated, sustained, and passed down through habits and traditions. As we've seen, scent in medieval Europe was deeply integrated into the cycles of life. Daily routines, religious rituals, social hierarchies, and seasonal rhythms. It wasn't merely about masking unpleasantness. It was about shaping identity, protecting health, and connecting to both community and faith. But this leads us to a subtle question. As time went on and new trade goods, medical theories, and urban changes arrived, would these everyday scent practices remain stable, or would they slowly evolve into something more ornamental and less functional, laying the groundwork for the perfumed courts of the Renaissance and Baroque eras? Over the past 3 sections, we've traveled through the sensory landscape of the medieval world. The garlic garlands and smoky hearths of peasant homes, the rosewater and cloves of noble chambers, the incense-filled churches, and the herb-strewn festival streets. We've seen how scent served as a tool of health, spirituality, identity, and survival. In this final section of Story 2, we'll explore how these fragrant practices evolved toward the end of the medieval period, how they laid the groundwork for later perfumery cultures, and what they reveal about medieval society's relationship with the unseen forces they believed surrounded them. Early in the medieval period, scent's role was primarily functional, protecting against disease, deodorizing living spaces, and signaling spiritual purity. But by the late Middle Ages, especially the 14th to 15th centuries, a subtle cultural shift was underway. Imported spices, perfumes, and exotic aromatics became more widely available through expanded trade networks linking Europe with the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia. Wealthier households increasingly used these substances not just to ward off bad air, but to display refinement and cosmopolitan taste. Rose water and clove oil, once medicinal, were now integral parts of courtly fashion. Pomanders became decorative objects as well as health tools, crafted from gold and silver, engraved with intricate patterns, and filled with layered scents that combined medicinal herbs with expensive spices like cinnamon or ambergris. This didn't mean the functional use of scent disappeared. People still burned rosemary to purify rooms during plague years, but among the elite, scent was evolving into a language of luxury. What you smelled like could now signal not only your piety or health, but also your place in the social hierarchy. Noble households, particularly in France, Italy, and the Burgundian Netherlands, became centers of fragrance cultivation. Gloves were soaked in perfumed waters, handkerchiefs were scented with imported oils, and clothing was stored with herbs or spices to maintain a pleasant aroma. In these circles, wearing a personal scent signature became increasingly important. A noblewoman might be known for the subtle rose and musk scent that lingered in her wake. A courtier might carry a distinctive pomander filled with ambergris and clove. Scent became part of how individuals announced their presence in social spaces, an olfactory marker, much like their clothing or speech. This emerging culture would later bloom fully in Renaissance and Baroque courts, where perfumes became elaborate, layered, and deliberately designed. But its roots lie in the late medieval marriage of miasma theory, imported goods, and aristocratic display. While nobles led the way in perfume use, expanded trade gradually allowed a broader section of society to access new scents. Urban merchants could sometimes afford spices and resins once limited to royal courts. Apothecaries in cities began selling ready-made scented waters, pomanders, and herbal blends. Markets in large towns sold dried herbs by the bundle, rose water in glass bottles, and sometimes imported ingredients like cinnamon sticks or cloves. Even if peasants couldn't afford musk or ambergris, they might incorporate small amounts of traded herbs or spices into special occasion scenting, weddings, feast days, or religious festivals. The result was a layered scent culture where garlic and sage still hung in rural kitchens, but city streets might carry the faint whiff of imported cloves during processions. This blending of local and global smells mirrored Europe's growing integration into wider economic and cultural networks. As medieval towns expanded, smell became both a practical and political issue. City councils recognized that controlling odors was essential to maintaining public order and health, at least according to miasma theory. Authorities in places like London and Paris issued ordinances against dumping waste near fountains or markets, or required tanners and butchers to work outside city walls to reduce foul smells in populated areas. While these measures were often inconsistently enforced, they reveal an awareness that public scent mattered. Urban authorities also took an active role in creating pleasant public smellscapes during festivals or royal visits. Streets might be strewn with herbs, church bells rung, and incense burned along processional routes. These acts were not merely decorative. They were political performances, signaling the city's prosperity, piety, and readiness to host important guests. In this way, scent became a tool of governance as well as daily life, shaping how urban spaces were experienced and controlled. While nobles experimented with imported perfumes and cities adopted new scent policies, rural communities held to older, herbal-based traditions well into the late Middle Ages. The rhythms of garlic hanging by the door, lavender sachets in linen chests, juniper smoke in winter, and rosemary on the hearth changed little over centuries. Rural people were less touched by imported luxury goods, but their domestic scenting practices were deeply rooted in practical knowledge of local plants. These traditions persisted well beyond the medieval period, often blending seamlessly with newer influences rather than being replaced. In many ways, the rural medieval home represented a parallel sensory world, quieter, simpler, but no less deliberate. Its smells were shaped by the land, the seasons, and inherited wisdom, a living archive of scent-based hygiene that survived long after perfumes became fashionable. Religious meanings attached to scent did not fade in the late medieval period. If anything, they became more complex. Incense remained central to worship, symbolizing prayer rising to heaven. Sweet smells continued to signify holiness in hagiographies, while foul smells marked sin, corruption, or death. However, as personal perfumes became more common among the nobility, religious moralists sometimes grew suspicious. Some preachers warned that overly perfumed bodies signaled vanity or moral weakness. Others argued that scent, when used modestly, was a gift from God and a sign of order. This moral tension between purity and luxury would carry into the Renaissance, influencing debates over cosmetics, fashion, and personal grooming. The same rose water that symbolized purity in the church could, in another context, be condemned as indulgent. By the end of the medieval period, Europe stood on the cusp of major transformations. New medical theories, the printing press, and global trade would soon reshape how people thought about health, cleanliness, and scent. But the foundations of European perfume culture were already laid. The medieval nose lived in a world where smell was information. It told you whether food was safe, whether disease was near, whether a church was holy, whether a noble had entered the room. People didn't separate hygiene and fragrance the way we do today. They were part of the same sensory toolkit for survival and identity. This world was intentionally scented. Garlic wasn't accidental. Herb bundles weren't mere decoration. Incense wasn't just pretty smoke. These were deliberate strategies, rooted in a blend of empirical observation, spiritual belief, and cultural expression. When we imagine medieval Europe, we often focus on what it lacked: modern plumbing, soap, deodorant, perfume as we know it. But to medieval people, their scent practices were rich, meaningful, and effective. They shaped their environments with rosemary, garlic, rosewater, incense, and imported spices, crafting spaces that were both protective and symbolic. Their world teaches us that hygiene is always cultural. What one society sees as cleanliness, another might see as ritual, status, or faith. Medieval Europeans lived in a highly olfactory society, where scent guided their health practices, social interactions, and spiritual lives. In a sense, garlic, herbs, and smoke were not merely medieval deodorants. They were the language of survival, whispered daily in hearth fires, laundry lines, church rituals, and market streets. Imagine now a medieval night. A cottage hearth burns low, releasing the last curls of rosemary smoke. Linen, freshly washed and scented with lavender, hangs near the fire. In a noble hall, rose water has been sprinkled on the rushes, mingling with the faint spice of imported cloves. In a nearby church, incense still lingers in the stone nave from evening prayers. The air is alive, layered, purposeful. It tells a story, not through words, but through scent. Chamber pots and streets, the reality of waste disposal in medieval towns. When we imagine medieval Europe, our minds often fill with images of bustling markets, stone castles, towering cathedrals, and torchlit streets. But beneath these romantic visions lies a far less glamorous reality, one that you could smell long before you could see it. In this story, we're stepping into the underbelly of medieval hygiene, the world of chamber pots, cesspits, waste-filled streets, and ingenious, if sometimes unpleasant, methods of waste disposal. Before sewers and plumbing, cities had to rely on human labor, gravity, and creative regulations to keep waste at bay. Tonight, we'll walk those streets, slowly, quietly, and discover how people manage the most inevitable aspect of daily life, where everything went after you were done with it. Medieval towns weren't built with sanitation in mind. Many grew organically around castles, monasteries, or river crossings, expanding haphazardly over centuries. Streets were narrow and often unpaved, twisting through neighborhoods in irregular patterns. Buildings leaned inward, their upper stories almost touching. Animals roamed freely, Pigs, chickens, goats, and markets filled public spaces with meat, fish, and produce. In this crowded environment, waste disposal was both unavoidable and constant. Human waste, animal dung, kitchen scraps, fish guts, and manufacturing byproducts like tanner's sludge or dyer's chemicals all flowed into the same environment. Without underground sewers, with a few exceptions in some Roman-influenced cities, towns relied on above-ground disposal systems, chamber pots, cesspits, open drains, and rivers. The result was a smellscape that defined medieval urban life. Chroniclers frequently described the stench of cities as overwhelming, especially in summer. But this doesn't mean medieval people were indifferent. Far from it. They developed rules, roles, and routines to deal with waste. Even if their methods seem primitive by modern standards, at the household level, the chamber pot was the essential tool. Nearly every home, from peasant cottages to noble manor houses, used ceramic, metal, or wooden pots for relieving oneself indoors, especially at night or during bad weather. In wealthy households, chamber pots might be made of pewter or even decorated ceramics, kept discreetly under beds or behind curtains. Nobles might have servants tasked with emptying them each morning. In more modest homes, a simple wooden bucket lined with straw could serve the same purpose. Once filled, the contents of these chamber pots were emptied into cesspits, open drains, or, quite often, directly into the street. In towns, this was such a common practice that many places developed a kind of nighttime ritual. Residents would open their upper-story windows and pour the contents of chamber pots down into the gutters below, often shouting a warning like "Garde à l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," or similar phrases in local languages. Imagine walking home at night through a narrow street, lantern in hand, as buckets of waste occasionally splashed from above. For urban dwellers, this was simply part of life. The warning calls became an informal sanitation system of their own. For more permanent storage, many medieval homes had cesspits, shallow, lined pits dug near or beneath buildings. Chamber pots and drains emptied into these pits, which were occasionally cleaned out by hired workers known in England as gong farmers. Cesspits were usually lined with stone or wood to prevent leakage, though not always successfully, and they could be surprisingly sophisticated in wealthier homes. Some were connected to rudimentary drainage systems leading toward rivers. Others were simply sealed pits that filled slowly over time. Once a cesspit was full, gong farmers or night soil collectors were employed to shovel out the waste, often under the cover of darkness. This was unpleasant but necessary work, and it was typically regulated by city authorities. In London, gong farmers were required to work at night to avoid disrupting daily life, and to cart the waste outside the city walls, where it might be dumped or used as fertilizer in nearby fields. The smell was, by all accounts, staggering. Chroniclers occasionally described cesspits bursting or leaking, flooding cellars and streets with foul liquid. A nightmare scenario for medieval towns. Perhaps the most common and simplest method of waste disposal was the river. Towns were often built along rivers for practical reasons: water supply, transportation, milling, and these rivers doubled as waste conduits. Human waste, animal carcasses, butcher's offal, tanning chemicals, and dye runoff were dumped directly into the water. In some towns, public latrines were built on bridges or overhanging the river. The famous London Bridge had latrines that dropped directly into the Thames. In Paris, latrines were built along the Seine. These were public conveniences, but also part of the city's waste management. The current simply carried everything downstream. Of course, this meant that the same river used for washing, cooking, and drinking was also the main sewer. People often fetched water upstream to avoid contamination, but pollution was widespread. Unsurprisingly, chronic outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and the bloody flux were common in crowded towns. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria, but they did understand that foul water could make you sick. They just lacked the infrastructure to fully separate clean and dirty sources. Not all waste simply disappeared into rivers or streets. In many places, human waste was collected and reused as fertilizer for agricultural fields, a practice that persisted well into the early modern period. Farmers valued the nutrients in night soil, as it was called, and urban authorities sometimes arranged for waste to be carted outside city walls to be spread on farmland. This created a kind of circular waste economy. What was produced in the town nourished the surrounding countryside, which in turn produced the food that came back into the town. While this may sound unsanitary by modern standards, it was a practical solution in a world where resources were reused whenever possible. Contrary to the idea that medieval towns were chaotic and unregulated, many cities developed ordinances to manage waste. Paris, London, Lubeck, Florence, and other urban centers issued detailed regulations controlling when and how chamber pots could be emptied, where tanners could work, and how cesspits were to be maintained. In London, for example, it was illegal to dump waste into certain streets during the day, and fines were levied against households that allowed their cesspits to overflow. Tanneries and butchers were pushed to the edges of town to keep their smells and runoff away from residential areas. In Florence, inspectors were appointed to check cesspits and drains. These regulations were unevenly enforced, but they reveal a clear civic awareness of hygiene and public space. Medieval city dwellers weren't indifferent to waste. They simply lacked the modern technology to manage it invisibly. For the medieval urbanite, waste management was woven into the fabric of daily life. Emptying chamber pots, avoiding gutters at night, listening for shouted warnings from above, these were ordinary experiences. The smell of open drains mingled with the aromas of bakeries, blacksmiths' forges, and herbal fumigations. Medieval chroniclers sometimes complained about the filth, but rarely with the disgusted astonishment of modern readers. To them, it was simply part of the city's character. Unpleasant, yes, but familiar by the end of the Middle Ages. Towns had developed a patchwork of waste management strategies: chamber pots, cesspits, rivers, regulations, and night soil collection. Some were surprisingly efficient for their time. Others were disasters waiting to happen. But here's the question: as populations grew and cities expanded, how sustainable were these methods? Could medieval towns continue to rely on rivers and manual labor to keep waste under control, or would their growing size eventually demand something more systematic? That's what we'll explore in the next section. Chamber pots emptied out of windows, cesspits beneath homes, rivers serving as natural sewers, and night soil collectors carting waste outside city walls. These methods worked, imperfectly, when towns were smaller and populations more dispersed. But as cities grew in the High and Late Middle Ages, these systems were increasingly tested. In this section, we'll go deeper into the evolving relationship between urban life and waste, looking at how social class, architecture, public policy, and sheer necessity shaped the way medieval towns tried to manage their most persistent problem. In the early Middle Ages, many European towns were relatively small. A few thousand inhabitants clustered near rivers, monasteries, or castle walls. Waste disposal, while unpleasant, was manageable through cesspits, rivers, and night soil collection. But from the 11th to 14th centuries, urban populations exploded. Paris reached perhaps 200,000 inhabitants by the 14th century. London and Florence grew rapidly. German trading towns like Lübeck and Cologne became dense commercial hubs. Streets that were once muddy paths between houses became crowded arteries of commerce, housing, animals, and waste. This growth placed enormous pressure on existing sanitation practices. Cesspits filled more quickly. Chamber pots were emptied more often. Open drains clogged faster. Waste that once seeped quietly into the ground or trickled into rivers now accumulated at a scale cities had never experienced before. The consequences were easy to smell. Chroniclers frequently described the unbearable summer stench of crowded cities. Parisian regulations from the 14th century mention residents throwing waste into the streets, to the great annoyance of passers-by. In London, legal records show numerous complaints about overflowing cesspits contaminating neighboring cellars and wells. Medieval cities weren't ignorant of these problems. They simply had limited tools to solve them. The urban boom created a sanitation challenge that would persist until the modern era. Medieval urban architecture often complicated waste management. Houses were built close together, with narrow winding streets and overhanging upper stories. Space was at a premium. Installing large underground drainage systems like the Romans had once built wasn't feasible in most medieval cities, especially those that grew without central planning. Many homes had cesspits located directly beneath living spaces, sometimes literally beneath the floorboards. These pits could leak into surrounding soil or flood during heavy rain. In some towns, drains or wooden pipes carried waste from cesspits to nearby ditches or rivers, but these were vulnerable to blockages and breakage. Upper floors created another issue. They allowed for waste disposal by window, a convenient but messy solution. Residents often dumped chamber pots straight into the street below, a practice so common that laws were passed regulating when and how it could be done. In Paris, it was forbidden to empty chamber pots during the day without shouting a warning first. In some German towns, regulations required that waste be poured into designated gutters rather than randomly. In wealthier homes, latrine rooms were built with chutes leading to cesspits or external drains. Some castles had surprisingly sophisticated garderobes, vertical shafts built into the walls, often projecting out over moats or rivers, where waste could drop away from the living quarters. Townhouses adapted this idea on a smaller scale, but maintenance was a constant issue. A blocked chute or overflowing pit could quickly render a home unlivable. The dirty work of managing urban waste fell to a unique class of laborers: gong farmers, night soil collectors, and drain cleaners. These workers operated mostly at night, when the streets were quieter and the smell less overwhelming in cooler air. Gong farmers in England were tasked with emptying cesspits and transporting the waste outside city walls. This was physically demanding, dangerous, and socially stigmatized work. They often descended into pits using ropes and buckets, shoveling out accumulated sludge by hand. City authorities regulated their activities closely. In London, they had to work at night and dump waste at designated locations far from the city's drinking water sources. Despite the unpleasantness, this work was essential. Without gong farmers, cities would have been buried in their own filth. Their labor sustained the fragile balance between urban density and sanitation. In some places, the waste was sold as fertilizer to nearby farmers. This created an informal waste economy that linked city and countryside. Human and animal waste was valued for its nutrients, despite the smell. This practice helped manage accumulation but also spread contamination if improperly handled, a problem medieval authorities couldn't fully control. Waste disposal in medieval towns varied significantly depending on social class. Nobles and wealthy merchants, living in large stone houses, often had private garderobes, latrine rooms with chutes leading to cesspits or drains. Servants were responsible for cleaning and maintaining these systems, including the unpleasant task of clearing blockages. Wealthy homes might also have cesspits lined with stone to minimize leakage, a luxury that poorer households couldn't afford. Artisans and tradespeople, living in smaller townhouses, relied on chamber pots and small cesspits. They emptied their waste more frequently, often into shared gutters or public ditches. Some neighborhoods had informal agreements about when waste could be emptied to reduce conflict. The poor, living in crowded tenements or shacks near city walls, often had no cesspits at all. Waste was dumped directly into nearby ditches, rivers, or open spaces. These areas were typically the most unsanitary, with standing waste, swarms of flies, and stagnant water. Disease was more common in these districts. Class didn't just shape how waste was handled, it shaped who had to deal with it. The wealthy could distance themselves through architecture and servants. The poor lived closer to the reality of waste every day. As urban waste problems grew, municipal governments introduced more detailed regulations. Parisian statutes in the 14th century forbade dumping waste into certain streets or onto neighbors' properties. Florence appointed inspectors to ensure cesspits were maintained. Lubeck required tanners and butchers to relocate their work outside town centers to reduce smells and contamination. In London, fines were imposed on households whose cesspits leaked into streets or cellars. Certain professions were regulated because of their waste output. Butchers, tanners, dyers, and fishmongers had strict rules about disposal. Tanneries, for example, produced chemical-rich effluent from curing hides, and authorities often relegated them to riverbanks downstream of drinking water points. However, enforcement was inconsistent. City councils had limited manpower, and many regulations relied on neighbors reporting violations. Some offenders were fined repeatedly, others ignored the rules with impunity. In practice, urban sanitation depended on a mix of formal regulations and informal cooperation, often reinforced by social pressure within neighborhoods. As populations grew, rivers, once a convenient solution, became increasingly polluted. The Thames in London, the Seine in Paris, and similar waterways in other cities were heavily burdened by waste from cesspits, chamber pots, tanneries, and markets. By the late Middle Ages, some chroniclers described stretches of urban rivers as foul and undrinkable, blackened by waste and choked with refuse. People fetched water from upstream whenever possible, but contamination was hard to avoid. Authorities attempted various measures, banning waste dumping near water sources, building public fountains fed by aqueducts, or digging new wells. But without underground sewage systems, rivers remained the primary means of transporting waste away from urban centers. The irony, of course, was that these same rivers were essential for drinking, cooking, washing, and brewing beer. Medieval brewers often preferred river water because boiling it for brewing killed pathogens, though they didn't know why. This created a strange dynamic where people lived alongside polluted water, adapted their practices to it, and survived through trial, error, and communal knowledge. By the late medieval period, European towns had developed a patchwork of waste disposal systems that combined ancient practices, ad hoc solutions, and emerging regulations. These systems worked well enough to sustain growing populations, but only just. Overcrowding, pollution, and disease outbreaks revealed their limits repeatedly. And this brings us to an intriguing question. As cities became denser and wealthier, could medieval waste management systems evolve into something more centralized? Or would they remain a messy, decentralized affair until technological breakthroughs centuries later? In the previous section, we examined how medieval towns adapted to population growth with regulations, architectural solutions, and labor systems to manage waste. But these methods, while functional in many ways, were inherently limited. As towns grew more complex, their waste systems often became tangled webs of cesspits, drains, and human labor, held together more by habit and communal effort than by technology. In this third section, we'll look more closely at the lived experience of waste management, how different groups navigated urban sanitation in daily life, how waste intersected with disease and public health, and how these practices shaped the sensory and social environment of medieval cities. When we picture medieval towns, it's easy to focus on grand cathedrals, timber-framed houses, and cobbled lanes. But to truly understand daily life, you have to imagine the street as a living, flowing channel, one that carried not just people and carts, but also waste. Many medieval streets had central gutters or shallow troughs designed to carry rainwater and liquid waste downhill, eventually reaching ditches or rivers. Some were lined with stones, others were simply packed earth. On dry days, these gutters became repositories of stagnant waste. On rainy days, they transformed into foul streams carrying everything from chamber pot contents to fish guts and animal dung. Residents adapted their movements accordingly. Shopkeepers swept the space in front of their stalls to keep it passable. People avoided walking near the gutters if they could. Wooden clogs and pattens, raised wooden overshows, became essential for navigating muddy, filthy streets without ruining one's regular shoes. Street cleaning, when it happened, was often organized locally. Neighborhood groups might band together to sweep and clear gutters before festivals or religious processions. City authorities sometimes paid laborers to clear particularly clogged streets. But overall, the street functioned as an open sewer, and everyone accepted this as part of urban life. That it's important to remember that medieval Europe was overwhelmingly rural. Urban life was the exception, not the rule. Waste disposal in the countryside looked very different. In rural villages, households often had direct access to fields, meaning waste could be spread as fertilizer more easily. Cesspits were simpler and less prone to overflowing. Because populations were smaller and space was abundant, people could bury or compost waste with relative ease. Livestock waste was also integrated into the agricultural cycle, collected for manure rather than left to accumulate. Urban dwellers, by contrast, lacked the space and flexibility of rural life. Streets, rivers, and cesspits were the only available outlets. While rural waste was part of the ecological cycle, urban waste was a growing management problem. This divergence shaped attitudes toward urban living itself. City chroniclers frequently remarked on the smells and filth of urban streets compared to the clean air of the countryside. In some ways, this early tension foreshadows modern concerns about urban sanitation and environmental quality. Although medieval people didn't understand bacteria or viruses, they were acutely aware of the link between foul smells and illness, a belief known as the miasma theory. According to this theory, disease was spread by bad air, or miasmas, arising from decaying matter. This wasn't entirely wrong. Waste did contribute to the spread of disease, but through pathogens, not vapors. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases were common in cities where waste contaminated wells and rivers. Historical records from towns like London and Paris include references to the bloody flux, a term for dysentery that frequently appeared in densely populated areas. During the Black Death in the 14th century, city authorities made efforts to clean streets and remove waste to combat the plague, believing that foul air carried the disease. In Florence, special cleanup campaigns targeted cesspits and garbage heaps. In London, officials tried to enforce stricter dumping regulations. Although these efforts didn't stop the plague, they do show that sanitation was recognized as a public health issue, even if the mechanisms were misunderstood. Interestingly, many cities mandated the burning of aromatic herbs and incense during epidemics. not to mask the smell, but to purify the air. This was tied to both miasma theory and religious ideas about cleansing spaces. These efforts to control urban air reflected both fear and ingenuity in the face of invisible threats. Some professions in medieval towns contributed disproportionately to waste and pollution, complicating urban sanitation. Tanners, who worked with animal hides, used caustic lime, urine, and other substances in the curing process. Their workshops produced large quantities of foul liquid waste that was often dumped into streets or rivers. Butchers generated animal blood, guts, and offal, which needed to be disposed of quickly before rotting. Regulations often required butchers to operate near city walls or rivers to minimize their impact, but their waste still affected urban waterways. Dyers and textile workers used chemicals and plant-based dyes, some of which were toxic or polluting. Their wastewater, often colored and pungent, entered drains and rivers unchecked. City councils issued regulations to relocate these trades to peripheral areas, but enforcement was inconsistent. The economic importance of these industries often outweighed sanitation concerns, leading to a persistent push and pull between commerce and cleanliness. Urban sanitation wasn't just a top-down affair. It relied heavily on local cooperation. Neighborhoods often shared cesspits or drains, which required collective maintenance. Disputes between neighbors over overflowing pits or waste dumping appear frequently in legal records. In some cities, neighborhood associations or parishes organized street cleaning days, often before major religious festivals. These events could be both practical and symbolic. Clearing waste was a way to prepare the city for processions, holy days, or royal visits, reflecting both communal pride and civic duty. Failing to maintain one section of the street could bring not just fines, but also social shame. Medieval communities were close-knit, and bad waste practices affected everyone. A leaky cesspit could flood a neighbor's cellar. Careless dumping could spread disease to nearby households. This social pressure was often as effective as formal law in maintaining basic sanitation that it's hard to fully imagine the sensory reality of a medieval town. Modern cities have hidden their waste systems underground. Medieval towns lived with theirs in plain sight and smell. Chroniclers describe a mixture of aromas. The sweetness of bread baking mingled with the acrid stench of tanneries, the sharp tang of human waste in summer heat, the smoky air from countless hearth fires, and the herbal undertones of fumigations and street strewing. For urban dwellers, this was simply the background of life. People developed scent literacy, recognizing smells that indicated danger, disease, or particular traits. A strong odor of waste might signal a broken drain nearby. The scent of tanneries told you which part of town you were in. In this way, smell was a navigational and social tool, as much as sight or sound. Although medieval towns lacked modern sewage, incremental improvements did occur. Some cities introduced covered drains in wealthier districts to reduce odors. Public latrines were built in strategic locations, often over rivers or ditches, to serve marketplaces and travelers. In a few exceptional cases, cities with Roman infrastructure, like Cologne or parts of Paris, maintained ancient sewers to some extent, though these were often silted up and poorly understood. Wealthier households experimented with improved garderobe chutes, stone-lined pits, and even early flushing mechanisms using buckets of water. These innovations were localized and uneven, but they show that medieval sanitation wasn't static. It evolved in response to population pressures, technological knowledge, and civic ambition. Despite these efforts, by the end of the medieval period, sanitation remained a patchwork of temporary fixes rather than a cohesive system. Streets carried waste, rivers bore the brunt of pollution, and neighborhoods relied on communal vigilance to avoid catastrophe. The unresolved question is this: as cities continued to grow into the Renaissance and beyond, would this piecemeal approach be enough to sustain urban life, or would it collapse under its own weight, forcing a revolution in sanitation centuries before modern plumbing? Through the first three sections, we've followed the story of medieval urban waste management from daily household rituals to the communal and civic systems that kept cities functioning. We've seen how chamber pots, cesspits, rivers, trade activities, neighborhood cooperation, and regulation all formed a fragile but surprisingly resilient sanitation network. In this final section, we'll explore how these medieval practices evolved in the later Middle Ages, how they paved the way for early modern sanitation systems, and what they reveal about the adaptability of medieval societies when confronted with the most basic problem of urban living: what to do with human waste. By the 14th and 15th centuries, European towns were entering a period of transition. Trade expanded, urban populations rose, and cities became more complex administrative and economic centers. These changes placed ever greater pressure on existing sanitation systems, many of which were inherited from earlier centuries and designed for much smaller populations. Authorities in cities like Paris, London, Florence, Lubeck, and Cologne increasingly recognized that ad hoc waste management wasn't enough. We begin to see more systematic attempts to regulate, organize, and sometimes innovate. Public latrines were constructed in busy districts, often built over rivers or large ditches. These facilities were primitive but provided a shared outlet for waste that could reduce random dumping. Some cities began installing covered street drains in wealthier or central areas to reduce odors and improve navigability. These were not underground sewers as we know them today, but wooden or stone-lined channels covered with removable slabs. Regulations became more centralized and bureaucratic. Cities appointed inspectors or officials responsible for monitoring cesspits, drains, and waste dumping. While these developments were uneven and far from universal, they signaled a gradual shift toward collective infrastructure rather than relying solely on household or neighborhood solutions. Another fascinating aspect of late medieval sanitation was the ritualization of cleanliness. Major festivals, religious holidays, and royal visits often prompted citywide cleanups, temporarily transforming urban spaces. Before Easter or Corpus Christi processions, towns frequently ordered residents to sweep streets, clear gutters, and empty cesspits. These cleanups weren't only practical, they were symbolic acts of purification. Religious festivals demanded clean streets for processions. Royal entries required cities to present themselves as orderly and prosperous. Parisian records mention entire neighborhoods mobilizing to strew herbs, wash streets, and remove garbage before important events. In London, waste collectors were hired to work overtime before royal visits. Lübeck's town council regulated how merchants had to keep their street fronts tidy for major fairs. These episodic sanitation drives didn't replace daily waste routines, but they show how cleanliness was embedded in civic identity and ritual. Cities didn't view waste purely as a nuisance. They understood its management as part of their social and religious fabric. At the household level, cesspits and garderobes slowly became more standardized and better constructed in wealthier homes. Stone linings reduced leakage, and some households began using simple flushing methods, pouring buckets of watered-down garderobe shafts to clear waste more efficiently. In castles and manor houses, garderobes were often built into projecting towers called garderobe turrets, allowing waste to fall away from the walls. Urban townhouses adapted this design in miniature. Waste chutes sometimes led to external pits, which could be cleaned more easily by gong farmers. There was also a growing awareness of the dangers of poorly maintained cesspits. Legal disputes from cities like London and Paris reveal neighbors suing each other over leaking pits that contaminated wells or flooded basements. These cases pushed households to improve construction and maintenance practices to avoid fines, lawsuits, or community anger. Though there was no technological revolution, these incremental improvements added up over time, laying the groundwork for more advanced systems in the early modern era. Rivers remained at the heart of medieval sanitation, and they remained heavily burdened. The Thames, the Seine, and other major urban waterways were both lifelines and dumping grounds. By the late Middle Ages, chroniclers frequently described urban rivers as foul, blackened, or choked with refuse. Cities attempted various measures, designating dumping zones downstream from drinking water points, building public fountains fed by aqueducts or wells to provide cleaner drinking water, thereby reducing reliance on river water. Passing ordinances forbidding certain trades from dumping waste directly into rivers. But without large-scale sewer systems, these measures could only do so much. Pollution remained an intractable problem. Brewers and bakers relied on boiling water to make it safe, while ordinary citizens developed local knowledge about where to draw cleaner water and when. Despite the pollution, rivers didn't drive people away from cities. Instead, urban dwellers adapted their behaviors, showing remarkable resilience. This adaptability would be critical in later centuries, when cities finally began to implement centralized sewage systems. It's easy to dismiss medieval sanitation as crude or unsophisticated, but in reality, medieval cities created workable systems within their technological and cultural limits. They combined personal practices like chamber pots and herb fumigation, household infrastructure like cesspits and garderobes, neighborhood cooperation for street cleaning and shared drains, municipal regulation to control dumping and manage polluting trades, seasonal and ritual cleanups tied to religious and civic life. This layered system wasn't perfect, but it sustained cities ranging from a few thousand to hundreds of thousands of inhabitants for centuries. It reveals a society that was deeply pragmatic about waste, adapting inherited practices from Roman times and blending them with new regulations as urban life evolved. By the end of the medieval period, Europe stood on the threshold of profound change. The Renaissance would bring new architectural ideas, hydraulic engineering advances, and a growing emphasis on public works. In some places, Early versions of public sewer systems began to appear in the 16th and 17th centuries, especially in rapidly growing cities. But these developments rested on the centuries-long foundation laid by medieval waste systems. The chamber pots, gutters, cesspits, gong farmers, and regulations of the Middle Ages may seem boring, but they were the necessary infrastructure that kept medieval cities habitable. Without them, urban life simply couldn't have functioned. Imagine, for a moment, walking through a medieval town late at night. The streets are dimly lit by scattered lanterns. From above, you hear a shout, "Guard à l'eau," followed by the unmistakable sound of a chamber pot being emptied. The gutters trickle toward the river, carrying the day's refuse away. Somewhere in the darkness, a gong farmer finishes his work, hauling waste beyond the city walls. It isn't glamorous. It doesn't smell sweet. But it's a system, improvised, human, and deeply ingrained. This was the invisible labor that allowed medieval cities to thrive, trade to flourish, and culture to develop. The bustling markets and grand cathedrals were built on top of this foundation, quite literally. The medieval approach to waste disposal reminds us that urban survival has always required ingenuity, even when the solutions are messy. Medieval cities faced challenges remarkably similar to ours: growing populations, limited infrastructure, public health concerns, and environmental pressures. Their answers were different, but their determination to make cities work was universal. And so, the story of chamber pots and streets is not just about filth. It's about adaptation, resilience, and the surprisingly sophisticated social choreography that kept medieval towns alive.